HTML5 and CSS and SVG and all those APIs and making sure that they get done to chat with you about testing. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm hoping, here we go. So, how many of you have ever reported a bug to one of the browsers out there? Not so many. How many of you expect the web to work? A lot more. I was starting to get worried a little bit. So, I was told this is a developer conference, the first W3C developer conference. So, I'm going to start right away with a little bit of code. I know it's in the morning, at least for those of you who are in the room, not for those of you who are online. But this is an example of a test. And we're going to do a little test here for the audience as well. So you're going to have three letters. There are three letters that will appear on this page if you cut and paste this code. A, B, C. They will be vertically stacked. What I'd like you to guess is in which order are they going to appear from top to bottom. And I'm going to give you only two choices, A, B, C, or B, A, C. So how many people will think that they're going to appear as A, B, C from top to bottom? Only two? How many people think that they're going to appear as B, A, C from top to bottom? 2, 3, 4? OK. And the rest, we don't know. All right. Well, I guess we're going to have to change the CSS specification and and indicating that we don't know. They are going to appear as A, B, C. And the reason is because there is one sentence in the CSS specification, if you look deeply into the specification, which says, oh, when you have a block level box inside an inline box, and that inline box has a relative position, then if you're translating the box within the page, which is what I'm doing right now with the top property, then the block level box inside that inline box is also being translated. So it will appear as ABC. The thing is, if you try it today in your browsers, well, you have probably a 25% of chance that it will not work in whatever browser you're using, globally speaking, of course. It varies a lot depending on the countries. And probably a 95% or more chance that it will not work on your mobile phone if you're using a smartphone. And this is for properties that have been defined 10 years ago. Relatively simple. But this is the current state of the web that we have today. And this is what we'd like to improve significantly. So of course, if you look at this test, you're going to tell me, but this is not a great test. Because let me rewrite the same test. This time, instead of using div elements, I'm using a span element for the first one. And I don't even have to use the display inline. And it's exactly the same test from a CSS perspective, but from an HTML5 perspective. Because HTML5 will tell you this is not a valid document. You cannot put a div within a span. You shouldn't do that in the first place. And indeed, if you're going to write something like that in your page, you're looking for trouble in the first place. I would agree with that for sure. Still, the previous test was perfectly fine. It was valid according to CSS and HTML5, and this one is not valid according to HTML5. So are both tests OK? Are they not OK? And I guess opinions are going to diverge. According to the specification, the first test is perfectly fine, on the other hand. So there is a lot of variation. When you do testing, you're going to find yourself in a lot of situations when you're not exactly sure. You have to set up a goal in terms of testing. And so the challenge that we are facing is of several folds. First is we're not testing one specification. We have the HTML5 specification. We have plenty of CSS3 specifications. The CSS working group was smart enough to split it into different modules. And so we have over, I stopped counting probably a year ago but it's the number keeps increasing on every single month. We have probably around 130 specifications or more nowadays. And which of those specifications are stable or not? Well, it depends. If it's a specification that was just proposed this month, it's probably not stable. If it was a specification that was proposed 10 years ago, well, a lot of it are stable, but see, you can still write tests, simple CSS tests, that will not work on all the browsers today. Of course, you're going to run into bugs in web browsers as well. They're not perfect. And also, specifications are not perfect either. Specifications have bugs. So, is it possible to test to perfection? Well, testing is an approximation. If you take a simple specification, for example, you can certainly write a series of tests for that, and it will work. I wrote one recently, which was testing a property on the document object. Actually, no, it was on the window object, and in JavaScript. And it was perfectly fine in the standalone document. I took the same document, and I linked to it from within an HTML object. And suddenly, the property was not working anymore. So even for something that's simple of a property on the window object, it was working in one case, but not in the other. So even for something simple, sometimes the amount of testing you do may not be enough to test all the conditions, because it's a combination of several specifications that we have here. Also, as well, when you do DOM manipulations, so you can test a CSS property as a color, and you can give a color using the style attribute to an element. But what if you do the same thing using JavaScript instead? And you do .style.color equal red, for example. Maybe it will not work, or maybe it will. So you have to test plenty of different conditions. And the fact that we are adding new languages into the web platform, for example, SVG is getting deployed in all the browsers nowadays, you also have to test HTML within SVG, because, well, it may work if it's just standalone HTML, but you put the same HTML inline within SVG, and suddenly it breaks. So we'll never get 100% coverage of all the specifications. So as I was saying, you have to set up a goal when you do testing. Who are you testing for? And you need to realize that you have several audiences. First, you have the people who are implementing the specifications. And so they like to have tests when they do the implementations. In fact, it's probably, one of them was indicating that it was half of his time was to write tests for when he was implementing one of those specifications. So that's one audience, and so they are interested in having some kind of test. And of course, the harder the tests are, the happier they are as well, because like that, they're testing all kind of corner cases. The manufacturers, people who are making mobiles or televisions and who are embedding HTML5 on their devices today, they also like to have tests as well, to be able to say, yes, we are supporting HTML5 or we are supporting CSS3 colors. And we can prove that to you with this series of tests. So they like to say that to whoever are buying their devices. The operators, which are deploying those devices on the network, they also like to test what kind of devices they are letting into their own network and to understand the diversity of all the devices that they have. Specification editors, people who are writing specifications also like to have tests to help them understand if the specification is right or not. Because sometimes you write a specification and you start writing the test and you realize this is not going to go far. And finally, there is you, the people who are writing content. Web developers, web authors, content providers, people who are writing a CRM, whatever software or individual writing HTML and CSS codes out there. So we've been doing testing in the past at W3C with more or less success. So for example, the CSS 2.1 test suites that we've been working on for several years, when we shipped CSS 2.1 to recommendation, finally, earlier this year, we had a test suite with it. And the recommendation was that is, again, a specific version of the test suites. that worked, but you will notice that we had some red at that time when we shipped the specification. And one of those red was a test that I just showed you earlier in my presentation, by the way. And so, you know, it's not like everything was perfect when we decided, OK, we are done with CSS 2.1. In addition, the CSS test suite itself, the CSS 2.1 test suites, well, we keep refining it as well, because bugs in the test. Or sometimes we realize that, well, the test is correct, but you know, really we need to change the specification as well. So with CSS 2.1, it is a stable specification, and hopefully we won't have to do that. But for other specifications, it may change as well. Another example is the SVG 1.1 specification. We released the second edition of SVG 1.1 as well. And again, we got several green and yellow and red on the screen. And how long do we have to wait before we actually ship something to be a recommendation that we can recommend to the entire web community as well? You know, should we have 2 implementations, 3 implementations, 4? Opinions diverge greatly on that. And you will always be able to find at least one of the tests which fails to pass on one of the implementations. So there will be limitation. So when you develop a test suite, you need to have a goal. Who are you writing this test suite for? And how long are you going to also take to write these test suites? Because you can take infinite time, for example, to write a test suite for CSS. And you know you're going to have limitation and trade-off, for sure. How many tests? You know, the more tests you have, the better it is. On the other hand, if all of your tests are relatively simple, well, the value of those tests is relatively limited compared to a test suite that would contain only a few tests, but all of those tests are testing all kinds of corner cases that are important for the implementations. You know, and developing those test suites needs a feedback loop, because it's like a specification which has bugs. The test suites will have bugs, and they need to be refined as well and maintained. And this is really hard work to do and takes a lot of resources. So having said all of that, you know, how do we write a test today? One of the things that we are trying to do at W3C nowadays is to harmonize the way all of our groups and contributors are writing tests, so that it's easy for people to understand how to write a test that could then be digested by one of our working groups. It's also easy for people to reuse those tests as well, because we want those tests to be available to the entire community. You know, you will be able to download those tests, run those tests yourself, and make up your own conclusions about how good or not an implementation is. And there are several techniques to write tests. They have both pros and cons. One of the tendencies nowadays is to write tests that can be run automatically as much as possible. And one of the reasons is we're not talking about 1,000 tests here. We're not talking about 2,000 tests for the web platforms. 2 weeks ago, we had our plenary meeting in California. And one of the browser vendors was saying, we have a quarter of million tests internally to test our web browser. We believe we need 3 or 4 times that size to really test our navigator online. So none of them are fully testing their software, and they're, to some extent, relying on the community out there to tell them when something gets broken, to people like you. But so in order to harmonize the way we write tests and for those browser vendors to be able to reuse those tests, or for those manufacturers to reuse those tests, or for people like you to reuse those tests as well, having an harmonized way and being able to run those tests automatically is going to be useful, because you're not going to click once, 1 million times on a button to say if a test was passed or failed. So one technique to use is what we call the test harness, developed by James Graham at Opera. And so it's relatively simple. It contains a set of assertions, and you only have to link to 2 scripts, which I have on the screen right now, to be able to run those tests. You will notice that those links are relative links. The reason is you don't want to put those links in absolute, is because you want to be able to download those tests and run them locally without relying on online resources. So if you want to, the link to the test itself is available on the previous slide if you click. Once you link to those scripts, then you can write your test. And here is a very simple test. I'm testing whether the first element child property, which is part of the element traversal specification and being integrated in DOM level 4. So I'm testing if this property exists on the element. It's a very simple test. The test is composed of a function which is being run. There is an assertion within this function which is being run as well. And then there is a description for the test. And if you run that, you will notice, if you notice on this slide that I have a div element here, which is going to be used by the JavaScript harness for you. And it will provide a nice little display indicating whether the test was passed or failed. And in this case, you can see that all of the tests were passed. And if there is a problem with one of the tests, it will actually it will show you the exception that was raised and so on. Another test, script test as well. But this time is done asynchronously. So I'm waiting for the load event on the window object to actually execute the test. So I'm first starting by initializing the test, and then within my onload event, I'm going to do what we call a step to run within that onload event. And when I'm done, I will tell that to the test harness. So the test harness knows that I'm done. One of the nice things about this test harness, in addition, is that there is a mechanism to listen to reports from the test themselves, whether the test was passed or failed, so that if you have a framework intended to run thousands and thousands of tests, it will basically listen to those events generated by the harness, JavaScript harness, and aggregate all the results for you. And by the way, you can run as many inside one file. You can put as many tests as you want. In fact, in the HTML5 specification test suites, we have one file that contains 10,000 tests just by itself. Sometimes it does crash some of the browsers out there. Another way to write tests is called what we call Reftest. And so what you have here is two files, basically. And the goal of those two files is to be displayed exactly the same way. And those two files are in general written in a device-independent manner, so you don't rely on something specific from the platform itself. And they are intended to display exactly the same way. So for example, here I'm testing the first letter CSS selector. And so on the left, I'm using the selector itself, so it's supposed to put the first letter of the sentence in red. And on the right, I'm actually writing in HTML what would be the output of such file if I was not, by using just pure HTML. Oops. By using just pure HTML. So then your framework can display those two files, compare the rendering of those two files, and if they are exactly the same, the test is passed, and if they are not exactly the same, then the test is failed. So it allows us to test rendering of pages like that for thousands and thousands of tests automatically. And that technique was actually invented by Mozilla, by the way. Another example, this time I'm testing an HTML5 element, the bidirectional element of HTML5. And on the left, I'm displaying test right to left, and on the right, I'm displaying test left to right. And I'm expecting the output to be exactly the same. So that's another way to write automatic tests. However, we have to acknowledge that there are some tests that, at the moment, we cannot run automatically. So an example of that is a page visibility specification, which allows you to know if a page is visible to the user or not. It's a new specification that is still being worked on. You can have some implementations of it in some of the browsers out there. But it requires that someone go and hide the window in some manner to be able to actually change the state of the visibility state attribute on the document object. And at the moment, we do not have a way, an automatic way to do that. And so in this case, we are basically asking the user, well, you're going to have to iconify the window and de-iconify it again. And we're going to monitor that the state change in the meantime as well. And at the end, you're going to have to click to one of those on one of those buttons to tell us if the test was passed or failed. And so that's, as far as I know, that's the only way to test this API at the moment. One of the new group we recently created, the Browser Tools Working Group at W3C, which is part of the testing activity we recently launched. The goal of that group is to standardize the WebDriver API. The WebDriver API is an API to allow you to drive the user interface which is composed of the web browser itself. So you can click on buttons, simulate user actions to a certain extent. And some of the navigators out there are already using it internally for their own testing. There is a specification available on the web, and we're looking to standardize it. It should be relatively fast because it has been used already in several browser vendors, as I just said. But it's still work in progress, and we still don't have, it's still not supported by everyone. There is still things to figure out before we can actually allow people to use it on a large scale in terms of testing. But hopefully, the more we're going to be able to add functionality within this WebDriver API, the more automatic those tests are going to be. So now that I showed you 3 ways to write tests, what can you do? Well, the first thing is you are part of the web community. When something doesn't work, please speak up. Because as I was saying earlier, the browsers don't test every single feature that they're providing into their navigator. So if you don't speak up, if you don't report a bug to them, it may not get fixed. So writing bug reports is important. Writing tests is even more important, because when you actually write tests, all of them can use those tests and ensure that they pass those tests as much as possible as part of their regression testing platform as well. You can pick a specification section and write tests for a specific section of the specification. There are still plenty of sections of the HTML5 specifications that are not being tested, and that we would welcome or test for those. Another thing that I always tell people when they are interested in the web platform is pick your most favorite feature that you would like to be implemented perfectly 5 years from now, and write as many tests as you can for that feature. This is the most sure way to make sure to get this feature implemented appropriately within a 5 years time frame on all the browsers and all the platforms and all the devices. If you don't do that, then don't come back to me and blame me for not having a feature well deployed on the web platform 5 years from now. So the more tests you're going to write, the more favorite features you're going to have, and writing tests for those, the better we're going to be in the long run. And again, keep in mind, even if there are some tests that are more interesting than others, every single test can make a difference as well. So you know, pick a specification. You know, in each of the status section of those specifications, we have a mailing list linked to. Go to that list, ask them, is there a section of a specification or a dedicated one specification that you need tests from, and you will likely get feedback, or this is where we need the most help on. And trust me, when we talk about CSS, HTML, and so on, there is plenty of work that needs to be done. And then contribute as many tests as you can. That will certainly help all of you in the long run. Thank you. We have a